We're talking about a drug that was supposed to save the world. One that was advertised as gentle, safe, non-addictive, and even perfect for children. You know, the kind of pitch that usually means the opposite. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's drift back to the late 1800s. When medicine came in pretty glass bottles and every chemist was one good idea away from global disaster. This is the story of heroin, the miracle drug that deceived the world. It's the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution is humming along, science is having its golden age, and everyone's obsessed with progress. Electricity, telephones, germ theory, the future looked bright. Unfortunately, so did the bottles of morphine sitting on every doctor's shelf. Because, for all their brilliance, people were still hooked on opium like it was an Olympic sport. See, opium was ancient, it came from the poppy plant, and people had been using it since, well, basically forever for pain, sleep, melancholy, or just because the world was stressful. The Victorians in particular loved it. It came in syrups, lozenges, and powders. Mothers dosed their fussy babies with soothing syrups that were basically morphine in cute packaging. It was the 1800s version of a bedtime playlist. The problem: morphine worked too well. It numbed pain, but it also numbed entire personalities. Addiction rates were rising fast, especially after the American Civil War, when injured soldiers returned home still clinging to their morphine bottles. So, by the 1890s, the medical world had a serious PR problem. How do you treat pain without creating addicts? Enter Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company that, at the time, was just starting to make its name. Today we know them for aspirin and headache commercials, but back then, they were in the chemical business, experimenting with dyes and new compounds. One of their star chemists was a man named Heinrich Dreiser. Think of him as the Tony Stark of early drug marketing, minus the conscience. In 1897, Bayer's lab assistant, Felix Hoffmann, managed to acetylate morphine. Basically, he modified the molecule by adding two little acetyl groups. Chemistry aside, what that did was change how the body processed it. When injected or swallowed, the new compound was absorbed faster and hit harder. In theory, that made it less likely to linger in the system and cause dependence. In practice, it made it way more addictive, but nobody knew that yet, or wanted to. When Hoffmann showed his new creation to Dreiser, the reaction was pure excitement. Dreiser tested it on animals, then on people, and was thrilled by how powerful it seemed. It produced all the euphoria of morphine, but supposedly without the side effects. A win-win, right? Dreiser named it heroin, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, because apparently humility wasn't part of the scientific process. In 1898, Bayer launched heroin commercially, branding it as a non-addictive alternative to morphine and a safe cough suppressant. Their marketing was, frankly, spectacular. You could buy heroin in bottles, lozenges, and even cough drops. Ads featured smiling mothers giving it to children with colds. Physicians were told it was the perfect remedy for tuberculosis, bronchitis, and general irritation of the respiratory tract. The ads promised relief, comfort, and moral safety, no danger of addiction. Imagine reading that while taking a swig of liquid heroin from a bottle. Shaped like a chemistry trophy. Doctors loved it, patients loved it. Everyone felt great, which of course was part of the problem. By the early 1900s, Bayer was exporting heroin to more than 20 countries. London pharmacies stocked it next to aspirin, which, ironically, was another Bayer product discovered around the same time. Bayer even produced a glossy manual called Therapeutic Applications of Heroin, which proudly recommended it for asthma, pneumonia, and, yes, the common cold. It was marketed as a civilized drug, a scientific advance, something pure and modern compared to crude old opium. It had the prestige of German chemistry behind it and the confidence of an age that thought every problem could be solved with a clever molecule. But here's where things started to unravel. By 1902, reports began trickling in that people were, in fact, getting hopelessly addicted to this non-addictive medicine. Patients who took heroin for coughs found themselves craving it even after recovery. Doctors noticed tolerance, the need for higher doses to get the same effect, and withdrawal symptoms that looked suspiciously like morphine addiction. The irony was painful. The drug invented to cure morphine addiction was stronger than morphine. That's like trying to fix your caffeine problem with Red Bull. The medical journals started filling up with warnings. British and American physicians wrote cautious letters about heroin habituation. Some hospitals began seeing patients with full-blown dependency. In 1906, the American Medical Association finally admitted that maybe, just maybe, heroin wasn't the miracle it seemed, but Bayer didn't rush to change the label. They kept selling it until 1913, by which point the backlash was impossible to ignore. The company quietly stopped production, but the damage was done. Heroin had already escaped into the wider world, and it wasn't going back in the bottle. Let's pause here for a moment, because this was part of a bigger pattern that kept repeating throughout modern history. A chemical is discovered, it seems miraculous, it's sold everywhere, and then a decade later, everyone realizes it's a nightmare. Cocaine followed the same path, so did barbiturates, and later, opioids like OxyContin. Humanity's optimism, it seems, is as addictive as the drugs themselves. Anyway, after Bayer stepped back, heroin kept circulating. By the 1910s, it had moved from medicine cabinets to the streets. In the US, the government began to take notice. The first serious effort to control narcotics came with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, a fancy way of saying you can't just sell this stuff anymore. It required doctors and pharmacists to register and pay taxes to prescribe opiates and coca-based drugs. The goal was regulation, but it quickly turned into prohibition in practice. Of course, prohibition never really stops demand, it just changes who supplies it. The same drug that once came in elegant glass bottles now arrived in paper packets in Bakley deals. By the 1920s, heroin had gone from doctors' orders to criminal enterprise. In Europe and the US, addiction became a social issue, then a moral one. The word heroin shifted from scientific to scandalous. Newspapers wrote about the heroin menace, a phrase that probably sounded very serious read in a 1920s newscaster voice. Politicians promised to crack down, moral reformers called for purity, and the public started treating addiction less like an illness and more like a personal failure. But the irony again was that the very institutions now condemning heroin were the ones that had once prescribed it to coughing toddlers. Collective amnesia, powered by moral panic. Let's float back for a moment to Bayer, who by this point were pretending none of this had ever happened. World War I broke out in 1914, and Bayer's reputation got tangled in German wartime propaganda, which didn't help. After the war, the Allies confiscated Bayer's trademarks, including the word heroin itself. The name became public domain, free to use, not that anyone wanted to put it on a bottle anymore. By the 1920s, heroin addiction was firmly a global problem. The League of Nations, the pre-UN, began organizing conferences to limit opium production and trade. But enforcement was messy. Heroin could still be made easily from morphine, and morphine could still be made from opium. Chemistry didn't care about borders or treaties. It was like trying to ban fire by outlawing matches. Meanwhile, the cultural perception of heroin began to change. It went from medical wonder to symbol of decay, from a product of science to an emblem of human weakness. The early addicts weren't just the poor or the desperate. They were often middle-class patients who had followed doctors' orders. But over time, as regulations tightened and legal access vanished, addiction migrated to the fringes. What began in bright laboratories moved into the shadows. And that's where heroin's second life began, no longer a medicine, but a myth. The world had learned that progress always comes with side effects, and that every miracle has a catch. But as we'll see in the next part, that lesson didn't stick for long, because humanity, bless its optimism, kept falling for the same story, just with new names on the bottles. So, let's drift forward into the next era when heroin went underground, shaped jazz culture, fueled war economies, and redefined addiction itself. So, last time, heroin had just made its grand fall from grace, from shiny Bayer product to banned narcotic. The company quietly retired it in 1913, governments cracked down, and doctors pretended they'd never prescribed it in the first place. But of course, drugs don't vanish just because someone writes a law. They adapt, they evolve, they find new audiences. And heroin, oh, it found plenty. The 1920s were messy years. The world was trying to recover from the Great War, rebuild economies and pretend everything was fine. Jazz was roaring, cocktails were flowing, and the moral guardians were having heart attacks about all of it. The US had banned alcohol in 1920, which worked about as well as you'd expect. Bootleggers thrived, police corruption skyrocketed, and Americans learned that prohibition just means find a different supplier. So, in that same climate, heroin slipped right in. It was cheaper than morphine, easy to smuggle, and small enough to move unnoticed. Morphine addiction had already laid the groundwork. Heroin simply filled the gap. At first, it was discreet. Addicts were mostly people who had started on morphine or codeine, often through medical treatment, and then switched over. Some doctors still quietly prescribed it. A few chemists even made it themselves technically illegal, but enforcement was patchy. The newly formed US Bureau of Narcotics tried to clamp down, but the drug had already gone global. In New York, small-time gangs began selling heroin around the same neighborhoods that speakeasies served gin. Chinatown, Harlem, and the Bowery became the early hubs. In Europe, the ports of Marseille and Shanghai played similar roles, gateways for the new underground economy of opiates. By the 1930s, heroin had become an international business, and not the good kind. It's worth noting that addiction in the early 20th century looked very different from today. There weren't rehab centers or 12-step programs. There was shame and prison. If you were caught using heroin, you weren't treated as a patient, you were treated as a criminal. Newspapers loved to dramatize it. They printed wild stories about dope fiends, describing addicts as dangerous, immoral, or barely human. Every headline came with a sense of moral panic, the idea that society was being corrupted from within by this new chemical menace, which was ironic, considering that 20 years earlier the same newspapers had advertised heroin cough syrup right next to soap and tonic water. This demonization wasn't just about drugs though. It was deeply tied to race and class. In the US, Laws were often written and enforced in ways that targeted minority communities, the same pattern that would repeat later with other drug panics. Heroin use became associated with poor urban neighborhoods, with jazz clubs, with people on the margins. The drug didn't change. The stigma just changed hands. And then came the jazz scene. This is where things get complicated. Because heroin, for better or worse, became woven into one of the most creative musical movements of the century. In the 1930s and 40s, jazz was exploding. It was raw, emotional, and alive, everything polite society wasn't. Musicians worked long nights, traveling constantly, performing in smoky clubs, always chasing that next perfect sound. And like every overworked artist in history, many turned to chemicals to cope. Alcohol, marijuana, benzodrine, and eventually, heroin. The list of names reads like a tragic roll call. Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday, Miles Davis, all brilliant, all struggling with addiction at one point or another. Heroin didn't create their genius, but it haunted it. For some, it dulled the pain of racism, pressure, and endless touring. For others, it just destroyed everything. Parker once said he started using heroin because it made the music come alive, but later he admitted it also nearly killed him. That contradiction, the illusion of control followed by collapse, would define heroin's entire century. The drug's effects fit oddly well with jazz's rhythm. It slowed perception, softened sound, made time feel elastic. In a way, it mimicked the improvisational flow of the music itself. Listeners described jazz as dreamy, hypnotic, floating. Addicts described heroin the same way. That overlap wasn't coincidence, it was chemistry turned culture. Meanwhile, governments were panicking again. By the mid-1930s, the League of Nations had realized that treaties alone weren't doing much. Illegal heroin labs were sprouting up in Asia and Eastern Europe, feeding Western demand. Shanghai became one of the main centers, a chaotic port city under divided colonial control, full of gangsters, refugees, and entrepreneurs with flexible ethics. Heroin production flourished there. Morphine was imported from India or Turkey, processed in secret refineries, and shipped worldwide. The trade linked Chinese warlords, French smugglers, and European chemists, a truly global network long before the word globalization became fashionable. In the US, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger went on the offensive. Anslinger was the kind of man who believed moral panic was a management strategy. He waged an all-out war on dope fiends, using sensational propaganda and stiff prison sentences. It was the early version of the war on drugs, decades before that phrase existed. Anslinger also targeted musicians, especially black jazz artists, as symbols of moral decay. He hounded Billie Holiday for years, eventually having her arrested in her hospital bed. She died not long after, handcuffed and under police guard. Her crime, a heroin habit that started after years of trauma and abuse. Compassion wasn't part of the policy manual. Still, heroin's spread continued quietly beneath the surface. Unlike alcohol or marijuana, it didn't have a loud counterculture or open rebellion attached to it. It was secretive, isolating. Addicts didn't form communities, they disappeared. The drug didn't make people riot, it made them vanish into themselves. That made it easier for society to ignore the problem, at least for a while. The Second World War added another strange twist. Wartime production disrupted opium supplies, especially from Asia, so heroin became scarce in many places. Addicts went through brutal withdrawals, often without medical support. But the war also pushed pharmaceutical research into new territory, synthetic painkillers like methadone, which would later become part of addiction treatment. Irony again, science solving problems it created last century. By the late 1940s, heroin was fully illegal nearly everywhere. The United Nations had replaced the League of Nations and inherited its anti-drug treaties. Yet despite all the paperwork, black markets kept thriving. New refining centers appeared in Europe, particularly in France, setting the stage for what would later be called the French Connection, a network that would dominate the heroin trade through the mid-20th century. But we'll get to that. For now, the world was in denial. The polite version of the 1940s story is that heroin had been defeated. The real version is that it had just gone underground, waiting for the next generation. Let's pause for a second and look at what heroin represented by this point. In 1898, it was science's shining achievement, clean, precise, modern. By 1948, it symbolized corruption, crime, and decay. Same molecule, completely different meaning. Humanity had changed the narrative, not the chemistry. The story of heroin had become a mirror, showing whatever society wanted to see. To doctors, it was a lesson in humility. To politicians, a talking point. To addicts, a cruel comfort. And to the pharmaceutical industry, well, it was a cautionary tale best left unmentioned. But of course, the 1950s wouldn't let it stay unmentioned for long. Because after the war came a new global order, new trade routes, new cities, and a new market of restless youth looking for escape. And heroin, ever adaptable, was more than happy to oblige. So, let's drift forward once more into the post-war boom. the rise of the French Connection, and the decades when heroin became both a symbol of rebellion and a weapon of destruction. Last time, heroin had officially been kicked out of polite society, banned, condemned, and declared a moral enemy, which, as history has repeatedly shown, is a pretty good way to make something more popular. So tonight, we're floating through the mid-20th century, the Cold War era, when television was new, jazz was evolving into rock, and organized crime was quietly becoming the world's best logistics company. And right in the middle of all that was heroin. Let's start in France, because of course, after World War II, the French port city of Marseille was a bit of a mess. It had been bombed, occupied, and liberated, not exactly a recipe for stability. But out of that chaos came something very efficient, an underground heroin empire. This was the birth of what would later be known as the French Connection, the network that turned Marseille into the global hub for heroin refining from the 1950s through the early 70s. Here's how it worked. Opium was grown in Turkey and parts of the Middle East, converted into morphine base, and shipped to Marseille. There, skilled chemists, actual professionals in lab coats, not movie villains with test tubes, refined the morphine into heroin. From there, it was smuggled across the Atlantic, usually hidden in cargo shipments or suitcases, bound for the United States. If you're picturing sleek gangsters in fedoras, you're not far off. The operation was mostly run by Corsican crime families, many of whom had been backed by French intelligence during the war for anti-communist work. After the war, they kept their networks but changed the product. It's one of those morally flexible situations governments like to forget later. By the mid-1950s, the French labs were pumping out high-purity heroin on an industrial scale, and New York was their biggest customer. Now, New York in the 1950s was a city of extremes. Glamorous uptown, gritty downtown, and in between a growing heroin problem. Addiction rates were climbing fast, especially among returning veterans and the urban poor. The drug was cheap, potent, and easy to get. Heroin dealers hung around Harlem and the Lower East Side, selling to everyone from dock workers to jazz musicians to restless teenagers. It didn't take long before newspapers started calling it an epidemic. But again, most of the people caught in that spiral weren't hardened criminals. They were people trying to escape boredom, trauma, or poverty. The 1950s are often remembered as a golden age of clean suburbs and smiling families. But that image had cracks. Heroin slipped into those cracks like water in a war. In popular culture, though, it was almost invisible. Addiction was taboo. You didn't talk about it. You didn't see it on screen. And if it happened in your family, you pretended it didn't. The addicts themselves were hidden, isolated in city corners society didn't want to look at. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe had its own quiet crisis. Post-war reconstruction had left cities flooded with refugees, ex-soldiers, and displaced workers. In Italy, France, and the UK, heroin was technically illegal, but smuggling and small-scale use persisted. London pharmacies still carried medical opiates for years, and doctors quietly prescribed them to patients who couldn't quit. One of the strangest experiments happened in Britain itself. Instead of punishing addicts, British doctors in the 1950s tried a new approach. The British system. It basically said, if someone's addicted to heroin, don't arrest them. Just prescribe pharmaceutical-grade heroin under medical supervision. It was shockingly reasonable. The idea was to keep addicts stable, functional, and out of the black market. And for a while it actually worked. Addiction rates stayed low, crime dropped, and patients lived somewhat normal lives. Then the US found out and thought it was madness. By the late 1960s, international pressure pushed Britain to scale it back, because nothing irritates a moral crusade like evidence. Now, let's float back to the States where the heroin business was booming, mostly thanks to the French Connection. In 1961, the United Nations tried once again to crack down on narcotics through the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. It unified all the old treaties into one big global ban. On paper, it was airtight. In reality, it was like putting a padlock on the ocean. By the mid-1960s, the US estimated that 90% of its heroin supply came through France. The CIA, interestingly, knew all about it. After all, many of those same Corsican traffickers were the ones the agency quietly tolerated because they were anti-communist. Politics first, consequences later. Heroin use, meanwhile, was spreading fast among young Americans, especially soldiers. And that brings us to Vietnam. The Vietnam War was many things, long, chaotic, and morally confusing. But for the troops stuck in the jungles, it was also a living nightmare of boredom and trauma. And when soldiers have nothing but time and fear, they look for escape. By the early 1970s, US military reports suggested that up to 15% of American troops in Vietnam were using heroin. The drug was cheap, pure, and everywhere. Some soldiers got it from local dealers, others from black market military channels. When they came home, they didn't leave the habit behind. Suddenly, American cities had thousands of returning veterans dealing with addiction. The US government panicked. Newspapers screamed about the heroin epidemic, and President Nixon declared drug abuse a national emergency. It became one of the driving forces behind the so-called War on Drugs, which officially began in 1971. Of course, declaring war on an emotion or a chemical is tricky business. You can't exactly invade heroin, but it made for good politics. Back in Marseille, things were getting complicated too. By the late 1960s, the French connection was starting to crumble under pressure. American and French law enforcement had finally started coordinating, and several major busts took down key figures. The most famous came in 1972, when authorities seized hundreds of pounds of heroin hidden in a shipment bound for the US. It was front-page news and later inspired the 1971 film The French Connection, which turned gritty narcotics policing into box-office entertainment. The real-life result was that production shifted again, this time toward Asia. By the mid-1970s, opium from the Golden Triangle, the border region of Burma, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand became the new source for most of the world's heroin. New players stepped in, new routes opened, and once again, chemistry found a way. Culturally, though heroin was no longer invisible, it had entered art, music, and film, usually as a symbol of tragedy or cool decay. In the 1960s, you had songs like Heroin by the Velvet Underground, which treated the drug not as a scandal but as an existential meditation. Lou Reed sang about it in a flat, detached tone, less glorifying than hypnotized, like someone watching their own downfall in slow motion. By the 1970s, movies like Panic in Needle Park and Midnight Cowboy brought addiction into mainstream consciousness. These weren't glamorous portrayals, they were bleak, quiet, and sad. The kind of stories that made suburban audiences uncomfortable, which probably meant they were finally honest. Let's not forget the darker irony here. While heroin was destroying lives on the streets, legitimate pharmaceutical companies were already working on new opiates, safer versions, controlled alternatives. Methadone was introduced as a maintenance therapy in the 1960s, giving addicts a legal, milder substitute. It helped many people stabilize, but it also started the endless cycle of substitution, one synthetic salvation after another, each promising to fix the problem created by the last one. By the late 1970s, heroin was everywhere and nowhere, a global ghost. It wasn't new anymore, just tragic. The headlines had faded, but the addiction hadn't. The French labs were gone, the routes had changed, but the pattern stayed exactly the same. Optimism, denial, crisis, and then a new generation repeating it all over again. So by the end of the 70s, heroin had completed its transformation from miracle medicine to underground epidemic, from cough syrup to counterculture symbol, and humanity, as usual, hadn't learned much. But the story doesn't stop there, because the next few decades would bring heroin to new continents, tie it to global politics, and give it an entirely new face, one that would dominate the 1980s and beyond. So, let's drift into the next chapter, a time of cartels, poppy wars, and the strange modern afterlife of a 19th century mistake. Last time, we left heroin in the late 1970s, busted French labs, disillusioned jazz ghosts, and a world that still hadn't quite learned that banning something doesn't make it disappear. So tonight we drift into the 1980s and 90s, a time of big hair, Cold War paranoia, and the kind of international hypocrisy only the late 20th century could manage. Because while world leaders were preaching about law and order, they were also quietly funding the very systems that kept heroin flowing. It's the decade when heroin became both a global business and a political tool. So, let's start with the source, the poppy fields. After the fall of the French Connection, most of the world's heroin production shifted east, to the Golden Triangle, the region where Burma, now Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand meet. It was remote, mountainous, and full of armed groups who didn't trust their governments. Basically the perfect conditions for an illegal empire. Farmers in the area had been growing opium for centuries, long before it became a global commodity. It was a crop that paid the bills when rice didn't. But during the Cold War, things scaled up dramatically. See, the US was busy fighting communism wherever it could, especially in Southeast Asia. That meant cozying up to anti-communist militias, many of whom happened to fund themselves through the opium trade. So, while American politicians condemned heroin on television, US intelligence agencies were, intentionally or not, helping protect the trade routes that supplied it. One of the biggest players was a Burmese warlord named Knesset, sometimes called the Opium King. He ran a private army of tens of thousands of men and controlled massive chunks of the Golden Triangle in the 1970s and 80s. His organization produced hundreds of tons of opium every year, much of which ended up as heroin in western cities. Knesset liked to present himself as a businessman, occasionally even offering to sell his entire operation to the US government in exchange for legitimacy. They declined, of course, but not before decades of half-hearted attempts to shut him down. He lived comfortably until the 1990s, when he retired into quiet exile, as one does after running the world's biggest drug empire. By the 1980s, heroin had two main homes, the Golden Triangle in Asia and a new rival, the Golden Crescent, spanning Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. And here's where things get even murkier. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the US started secretly funding Afghan Mujahideen fighters through the CIA's Operation Cyclone. Billions of dollars in weapons and supplies flowed into the region to help drive out the Soviets. But among those same fighters were traffickers who used the chaos of war to expand opium production. The logic was simple. Weapons cost money, and opium made money. By the mid-1980s, Afghanistan had become the world's largest opium producer. American officials claimed ignorance, but plenty of journalists and insiders noticed the pattern: anti-Soviet rebels growing opium under CIA-backed protection. So yes, while the US government was declaring a war on drugs at home, it was indirectly supporting drug-funded militias abroad. The irony could probably be seen from space. Meanwhile, in Western cities, heroin was morphing into something new in the early 1980s. It wasn't the glamorous drug of the 60s anymore, it was the desperate one. In New York, London, and Berlin, heroin hit marginalized communities hard. Addiction was rampant among the poor and unemployed, especially as deindustrialization gutted urban neighborhoods. And then came the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Sharing needles became one of the fastest ways the virus spread. Suddenly, heroin addiction wasn't just about overdose, it was also about disease. Governments, slow as usual, responded with punishment instead of help. In the US, users were arrested by the thousands. In Britain, they were quietly offered clean needles. The difference in outcomes still speaks for itself. Heroin's public image reached its lowest point, no longer romantic, no longer mysterious, just grim. The word itself became shorthand for decay. But if you zoomed out from the cities to the global scale, business was booming. By the late 1980s, heroin production was estimated in the thousands of tons. The global value of the trade was measured in tens of billions of dollars. And wherever there was instability, opium followed. Burma, Laos, Afghanistan, the pattern was consistent. Weak governments, strong militias, fertile soil, and desperate farmers. Cartels and traffickers developed their own microeconomies. Pakistan became a key transit route. In Turkey, morphine was processed before heading west through the Balkans. Italian mafia families handled European distribution. It was globalized crime long before the internet made globalization trendy. And yes, law enforcement tried to fight it with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Every so often a massive drug bust would make headlines, accompanied by a politician declaring victory. But behind the scenes, production kept increasing. You can really defeat a drug that pays half the bills in a war-torn country. Back in America, heroin was evolving culturally again, now tied to punk and grunge scenes. In the 1980s, it showed up in punk clubs, a rebellion against everything clean and corporate. By the 1990s, it had followed that sound to Seattle, where musicians like Kurt Cobain and Lane Staley turned their private pain into art. Both struggled publicly with addiction, and both became tragic symbols of an era. Heroin had always attracted artists, not because it made them creative, but because it made the world quiet. It numbed the noise. And for people living in the loud fluorescent anxiety of late capitalism, silence could feel like relief until it killed them. Media coverage of celebrity overdoses would spike, politicians would promise action, and then everyone would forget. The pattern repeated like clockwork. Meanwhile, back in Afghanistan, something new was happening. The Soviets had withdrawn in 1989, leaving behind a shattered country full of weapons, warlords, and poppy fields. With no central government, opium became the de facto currency. Through the 1990s, production soared again, much of it under the watch of the Taliban, who used drug profits to fund their rule. By the end of the decade, Afghanistan was supplying over 70% of the world's heroin. It was an empire built on addiction, one side growing it, another side consuming it, both pretending the other was the problem. By the 1990s, global heroin use had reached new heights. In Russia, newly opened borders meant new trade routes. In Eastern Europe, corruption made enforcement laughable. In the US, inner cities were still dealing with the fallout of decades of neglect. And then came the next chapter in the irony parade: prescription opium. Pharmaceutical companies began aggressively marketing painkillers like OxyContin, claiming they were safe, non-addictive, and perfect for long-term use. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly how Bayer sold heroin a century earlier. Doctors prescribed them freely. Patients became dependent. When the pills ran out, many turned to heroin, cheaper, stronger, and easier to find. The drug that had been defeated in the 1970s quietly made its comeback through the front door of modern medicine. By the end of the 1990s, heroin was both old and new, a ghost from the Victorian age haunting the modern world. Governments had waged wars, chemists had made substitutes, and societies had written entire moral codes around it. But the story always circled back to the same human need: escape. From Bayer's glossy ads to war-torn fields, from jazz clubs to hospital wards, heroin's journey had been one long loop of invention, denial, and regret. And as the 21st century approached, the world was about to learn that the story wasn't even close to over, because heroin's chemical children, the modern opioids, were waiting in the wings, ready to repeat history all over again. So let's drift one last time into the modern era, where heroin isn't the miracle drug or the street poison anymore, but a mirror reflecting how little we ever actually learn. we wrap up the story of heroin, the drug that started as a medical miracle, ruined millions of lives, and somehow inspired a whole new generation of safe painkillers that did the exact same thing, because of course it did. When we last left off, the 1990s were fading out and pharmaceutical companies were stepping in to fill the void. Heroin had supposedly left behind. They didn't call it heroin anymore. That word was bad PR, but the chemistry was close enough to be cousins. Let's start with OxyContin. In 1996, a company called Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family, launched OxyContin with one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in medical history. The pitch was simple. It's strong enough for cancer pain, but safe enough for everyday aches. Doctors were told it wasn't addictive. Sales reps handed out free samples and bonuses. Pain became the fifth vital sign, and everyone was encouraged to treat it. The result, by the early 2000s, millions of Americans were taking opioids daily, and many of them didn't even realize they were taking something chemically similar to heroin. Of course, the body doesn't care about brand names. It reacts to molecules. And when people were cut off from prescriptions or wanted something cheaper, they turned to the street where heroin was ready and waiting. By 2010, overdose deaths were climbing fast. Heroin was back in a big way, just with a different entry point. But this time, the chemistry got darker. Around 2013, dealers started cutting heroin with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that's about 50 times stronger. It was cheaper to make, easier to transport, and terrifyingly potent. You couldn't see or smell it, but one extra grain could be the difference between a high and a funeral. The result was an explosion in overdose deaths. In the US, by 2017, more than 70,000 people were dying per year from opioids, prescription or otherwise. Entire small towns were hollowed out. Police officers carried Narcan like it was hand sanitizer. And for once, politicians stopped blaming junkies and started blaming corporations. Progress, I guess. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, heroin's grip never really loosened. In Afghanistan, the poppy fields never stopped blooming. After the US invasion in 2001, production actually increased. The Taliban had briefly banned opium before 9/11s, but once the war began, the fields came roaring back, because, again, war costs money. At one point, Afghanistan was producing more than 90% of the world's heroin. It was the country's biggest export, more valuable than all its legal industries combined. Everyone knew it, and everyone pretended they didn't. Western officials talked about nation building, but the most consistent nation they built was an economy based on poppies. Even after the Taliban's return to power in 2021, opium didn't disappear. They announced another ban, but history says those don't tend to stick. When your country's survival depends on a flower, it's hard to pull up the roots. Back in the West, the crisis evolved again. Heroin and fentanyl blurred together into one market. Pills, powders, patches, all different doors to the same destination. The human cost has been staggering. Entire generations have grown up losing family members to overdose. Funeral homes in small towns doubled their staff. And the stigma around addiction, the idea that it's a moral failure rather than a medical condition, still lingers, even after a century of evidence to the contrary. Governments have tried new approaches, needle exchanges, safe injection sites, opioid substitution therapies like methadone and buprenorphine. They work, they save lives. But they also require admitting that addiction is something to manage, not eradicate, and that's a hard sell in countries that still believe every problem just needs tougher laws. Let's pause for a second and take in the irony. In the early 1900s, heroin was legal and advertised as safe. By mid-century, it was illegal and sold on the street. By the late 1990s, it came back under a new name, OxyContin, and was legal again. Each time, the same mistake. Trust the marketing, not the chemistry. Bayer, Purdue, and dozens of others all promised relief, and all delivered dependency. It's like a century-long loop of denial, wrapped in glossy packaging. There's a quiet tragedy to how predictable it all is. Humanity's relationship with pain has always been messy. We want to escape it, not understand it. Every era has its solution. Laudanum, morphine, heroin, oxycodone, and every era swears this one will be different. But pain doesn't change, neither does the brain. The same receptors that made heroin feel like a miracle in 1898 are the ones that make fentanyl lethal now. The science hasn't betrayed us, our optimism has. Today, heroin itself is almost old-fashioned. Street supplies are often fentanylist or replaced entirely. Pure heroin, the stuffed Bayer once put in neat little bottles, is rare. It's like vinyl records. Collectors know it exists, but the world has moved on to synthetic streaming versions, yet the damage lingers. Not just the deaths, but the mistrust. Patients in real pain are now terrified of asking for medication. Doctors are afraid to prescribe, and in between are the people who just want to feel okay, stuck in a system that can't decide whether to treat them or arrest them. Heroin's story isn't just about drugs, it's about cycles, about how societies swing between indulgence and punishment, belief and denial. In the Victorian age, people believed science could solve everything. In the 20th century, They believed the law could. Now, in the 21st, we're left trying to untangle both. If there is any lesson here, and it is not an uplifting one, it is that humans will always look for relief. Some find it in religion, some in art, some in substances that make the world a little quieter. The tragedy begins when relief becomes dependence, and when those in power turn that dependence into profit. So, as we close this long-tired loop from Bayer's lab benches to the poppy fields of Afghanistan, from the jazz clubs to the clinics, heroin stands as the ultimate mirror. It began as a cure, it became a curse, and a century later it still reflects the same human craving to numb what hurts, no matter the cost.